Um, all right. So we want to welcome our friends Jean Martin Bauer and Ross Smith. If we could put them on the screen, please. All right, excellent. Welcome back. Welcome back to you, Jean Martin. Welcome to you. Welcome to you, Ross. I think we'll start with Jean Martin. Okay, we'll start with Ross. Ross, please welcome, and you have the floor.
Great, thanks a lot, Stefan. And you'll get a two-parter today from Jean Martin and I. And thanks for having us on. And I think we're happy to have the chance to talk to you about the new report that has been released. Jean Martin will talk in some detail about that, but the news release that we've also just put out. To really draw attention to what is quite an alarming funding situation at the moment for humanitarian food assistance. And message I want to leave you is that we really are, in some countries, at a breaking point right now at a time of record hunger levels. I'm going to talk a little bit specifically about 6 countries that we want to draw attention to. But Jean Martin will put this in the global context as well. As you know, there's in the time of rising needs, we are seeing declining funding and available resources, and this is putting people at a breaking point, especially those that are the most vulnerable, that rely on our humanitarian assistance, especially in fragile and vulnerable contexts. I will talk a little bit about Afghanistan, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Haiti, Somalia, South Sudan, and Sudan. And in these 6 contexts, we see significant reductions in our operations and the operations of our partners. And that goes from cutting people completely off of assistance, reducing rations, reducing the duration of assistance. And many vulnerable people are completely without a safety net or a landing pad at this point in time. This is in the context of 319 million people globally that are acutely food insecure, 44 million of those at emergency levels of hunger. And we are in an unprecedented time in WFP's history of 2 concurrent famines. And the number of people facing famine-like conditions has doubled in the last 2 years to 1.4 million people across 5 countries in Gaza, Palestine, Sudan, South Sudan, Mali, and Yemen. And we expect that number to rise. We have fewer resources, as I said, than ever before, and we're expecting a 40% reduction in the level of our assistance this year and potential additional reductions next year, all of which mitigates our ability to meet the rising hunger across the world. Let me speak a little bit about Afghanistan and the other 5 countries before I turn it over to Jean Martin. Just to say, in Afghanistan, a country with more than 10 million people that are hungry, facing acute food insecurity, we have assistance to reach less than 10% of those people. We expect pipeline breaks or funding breaks as early as November of this year, and we're only going to be able to provide assistance. Typically, there is a winter season assistance, humanitarian assistance packages for those living in remote and cut-off areas during the winter. And normally that is quite a large program for us, and this year, less than 8% of those in need for winterization support will receive that support. So without additional funding, millions will suffer through this winter season. We are seeing early indications of rises in malnutrition as a result of reductions that have already happened in Afghanistan. I think there is a narrative out there that Afghanistan is no longer a humanitarian crisis, and I think it's important that we draw attention to the real needs and the real desperation in Afghanistan. Turning to Democratic Republic of Congo, we're seeing record levels of hunger there, more than 27 million people facing acute food insecurity. And our plan is to assist at the beginning of this year, less than 2.3 million of those. Those are people in IPC levels 4. But due to funding gaps, we're now focused only on 1 million people the middle of this year, and we're reducing that number down to 600,000 before the end of this year, in October of this year. So we will face a complete funding break in February of next year for our assistance in the Democratic Republic of Congo. A colleague on the floor was asking about some of the conflict dynamics in the East, and we're very concerned about the situation in the East, where more than 90% of our support goes to support those that have been displaced and have been affected by conflict. Turning to Haiti, Haiti has, I think is in some ways there is a minor success story that we are seeing of reductions of people in IPC 5-like conditions facing famine because of some targeted assistance in specific areas where these were hotspots. But still it's facing record levels of hunger. And we've been forced to suspend our hot meals program for displaced people. And we've halved monthly rations because of funding issues there. The one thing I will also mention on Haiti is that, in Haiti and other nearby countries through the Caribbean and that part of Latin America, where we have a hurricane season, normally we have preparedness for this hurricane season and the displacement that results from that. And this year we have much less preparedness than we've had previously. Turning to Somalia, we have downsized considerably our support in Somalia over time. So over the last year, we're providing assistance to less than 25% of the people that we were a year ago. So just 350,000 people will be targeted in November for our emergency assistance. And I think this is at a time when we are seeing some worrying security dynamics in Somalia, and continued displacement in some parts of Somalia. And so it's a real concern for us whether there is going to be the safety net to support people in Somalia through other funding streams, and a vacuum on the humanitarian front for sure. The last two countries on South Sudan, just to say South Sudan, has the humanitarian response in South Sudan has consolidated considerably over the last 2 years, but certainly over the last year. We are now working on famine prevention, targeting those hotspots that are facing IPC 5, and we're having to reprioritize assistance from populations in IPC 4 to support those that have been displaced by the recent floods, record levels of floods in South Sudan. So we're shifting in South Sudan away from what used to be a very large program in the absence of significant government support for many people to one now that is really famine prevention and moving from hotspot to hotspot. And then finally in Sudan itself, I think one thing to point in Sudan is, given the scale, the world's largest humanitarian crisis, we have been able successfully last month, in August, we reached, the month before last, we reached 4.1 million people, which is a real effort with the logistics footprint and the dynamics of conflict in the country. Half of those people in hard-to-reach areas in Darfur and South Kordofan, and half in other areas. But we do have the capacity in Sudan to reach somewhere between 7 and 8 million people, but we cannot because of funding constraints. So unless we receive additional funding in Sudan, we will have to continue to start reducing our footprint in Sudan and our reach in Sudan. So that's just a quick overview there, and there's more details, I think, in the press release, but I'm going to turn it over, Farhan, if that's okay, to Jean Martin to provide a little bit of overview of our global report.
That's great. So welcome, Jean Martin. The floor is yours.
Thank you. To add on to what my colleague Ross has explained, we have a report out called A Lifeline at Risk that outlines the impacts of these funding cuts. If we were in a situation of low need and low resources, we wouldn't have to do a report of this type, but it's really this disconnect between very high needs for food, for a food response, and lower availability of funding. That's why we had to do this effort, and that's why we're here. I want to emphasize one number that you want to take away from this talk, is that we estimate that 13.7 million people will fall into emergency levels of hunger as a result of funding cuts. This is a substantial number. Ross explained to you that you have 44 million people in that category of hunger at this moment before the funding cuts. So we estimate 13.7 million more. That really moves the needle in terms of acute food insecurity worldwide. This shows that this is a substantial impact. I wanted to explain what that means at the country level as well. We're seeing 1 million refugees in Uganda no longer receiving rations, and those that continue receiving rations are receiving 40% to 20% rations. We're seeing malnutrition increase amongst the children who are in these refugee communities. When children don't receive enough healthy food under 5, they carry those consequences throughout their lives. In Afghanistan, we're seeing a 16% rise in acute malnourished children admissions in health centers because these centers have closed, or these centers no longer have the staff required to implement the programs. We're now turning away women who turn up at these health centers with their children, and because we have nothing to give, nothing to provide. One of the key features of the impact of funding cuts has been the gaps in preparedness that are now emerging. Ross mentioned the issue in Haiti. There's no contingency stock in Haiti. There had been one since 2016, since Hurricane Matthew. We've learned that in a geography as risk-prone as Haiti, you need to have food stocks in country. And that's a stock that's helped time and again meet the urgent needs that were created by the 2021 earthquake or by episodes of civil strife in the country. Well, there's no contingency stock, and we're still in the hurricane season that lasts until November 30th. So careful about the impacts that could have on preparedness and the ability to respond to a sudden onset emergency. Some of the hard-won gains that we've had for the past few years in places like the Sahel are being eroded by these cuts. In the Sahel, we'd lifted about 500,000 people from dependence on food aid, people who were exposed to recurrent shocks like droughts. Now that the funding cuts have kicked in, those gains are going in reverse. Building resilience is like rolling a ball up the hill, and now that the funding has been cut, well, the ball's sliding back down the hill. The consequences are irreversible for people facing malnutrition, and there are also impacts on the system itself. We need to be mindful that national economies in some cases are very dependent on foreign aid. In the case of South Sudan, it's about 25% of the GDP, and that will have impacts on the country's currency, on the country's macroeconomic situation. We're also emphasizing the fact that you've got a very clear link between increased food insecurity, and these funding cuts are increasing food insecurity, and phenomena such as migration and the stability of some of these geographies. Now, in terms of the way ahead, I'd like to make sure that we understand that we should really focus on famine prevention going ahead. That's probably a realistic goal for the humanitarian community. We do have 2 concurrent famines, as Ross mentioned. Responding to those and avoiding any other famines from popping up is essential. We've only had 5 famines declared by the IPC system since its creation 20 years ago. We have 2 at the same time right now. This shows that the severity of this food insecurity should be tackled by a deliberate effort to prevent famine. We need to make sure we align with local actors. Part of the silver lining that we're seeing in this situation is that governments in some cases are stepping up. We're seeing remittances increase in some cases, and Haiti's a case where remittances from outside have increased and partially compensated for the decline in assistance. And this is where humanitarians need to find new ways of working. And finally, what we need to do is safeguard the data and the information systems that have been threatened by this situation of the funding cuts. Now, what we need to know is that the data and analytics that are the GPS of the humanitarian system, and that GPS is under threat. Without it, we might get lost. We might not be going in the direction we need to go. Let's make sure we keep the data flowing in the humanitarian space. The report is called A Lifeline at Risk. It's available online. Thank you for your interest. Back to you.
Much. I'm going to open the floor up for questions now. First, Namo.
Yes, thank you, Farhan. I have 2 questions. One of them, you said you expect this to get worse. I think Ross said that. Is that because you expect further loss in funding, or is it because of the geopolitical situations in those countries or that are deteriorating? Can you please explain that? And the second question is, how big of an impact has the loss of funding from the United States, from the Trump administration, been on the situation, on the growing rate of hunger around the world? Thank you.
Great. Thank you for the questions. Just to say that, in the message about it getting worse is really, yes, we don't know what the future holds in terms of funding, but certainly the forecasts we have are not overly positive. But I think, more specifically at the field level, on the ground, at the household level, the coping strategies are being eroded. So it's only so long that you can go by selling your assets or taking your kids out of school or moving or doing these sort of things. And these can be quite deleterious to a household over time. And so, without the support that is often there from the humanitarian system, we see people slipping further and further behind. And so I think this is one of the phenomena that we're very concerned about. And so without, a parallel rise in funding for social programs in many of the countries within which we work, or for stable governance, people will slip into, worse and worse situations. So that's really what we see happening. And Jean Martin was explaining some of what that actually looks like from the study that we did. Your second question on cuts, we have seen reductions from many of our partners. So it's not just the U.S. partner. U.S. funding. And of course, we understand, the global context of this funding right now, but we're certainly doing all efforts we can to ensure that investments that our partners are making with us are going as much as possible to people in need.
Abdul Hamid?
Thank you for the briefing. Abdul Hamid Sayam from the Arabic daily Al-Quds Al-Arabi. My question is to Mr. Smith. Why you left out Palestine when you mentioned these 6 countries? Is because Palestine is not on that level, or because it's not recognized as a state? And my second question related to Gaza, what can you tell us more about your preparedness to rescue the situation in Gaza? Where are your storages? How many trucks you can send to Gaza? And your coordination with UNRWA and OCHA in sending humanitarian aid with large volume to Gaza. Thank you.
Great, thanks for the questions. No, I didn't focus on Gaza. We didn't focus on Gaza in this news release, or Palestine in this news release, because the funding shortage is not as acute for Palestine. There's other issues that we have been discussing for Gaza, but it's not the acute funding shortfall there. And indeed, we are prepared for a scale-up response in Gaza. I think Stefan has answered some of these questions, but certainly we have 3 months of food stocks at the ready to scale up, and we're working with all partners on to be able to do that. And I think Stefan highlighted some of the early day challenges we see. It's very fragile, very unpredictable at the moment, but we remain hopeful, because we must be hopeful that this is the way forward.
Thank you. This is Farnoosh Shamiri with the Associated Press. Thanks for doing this briefing. I wanted to ask, has there been, as member states and, global countries and leaders have decided to scale back humanitarian aid, has there been has there been a private sector effort to fill in some of those gaps? And is there an ability for other funding streams that don't come from governments to be able to kind of divert the, negative and destructive path that humanitarian assistance globally is going?
Thanks. It's a good question. I think that in many countries we've seen humanitarian assistance, in some cases be a substitute for what should be, a well-funded social safety net program, for example. And in some countries they either cannot be afforded, or there isn't the governance to allow that to happen. And so, as a last resort, humanitarian assistance has been needed. So we are definitely, in addition to advocating for humanitarian funding for these acute crises and for famine prevention, as Jean Martin mentioned, we are at the same time advocating that others step up. We need financial support for from host governments and for host governments to fund the needs of the most vulnerable in these countries. And to answer your question specifically, there has been some movement there, but I don't think we have seen certainly an ability to fill the gap that's been left by the decline of humanitarian funding.
Yes, Noreen?
Thank you very much. This is Noreen Hussain with IPS News. I wanted to just quickly ask on, in the report you have highlighted, I just want to ask why you chose these specific countries, Afghanistan, DRC, Uganda, if I recall, South Sudan and Sudan, for the focus of this report, when there are when there are other countries and communities that are also being impacted by the funding cuts by WFP. So that's my first question.
Okay. Maybe there's two things here. We have one is the news release, and one is the report that Jean Martin mentioned, which did also cover a selected group of countries. Just to say that, from the countries that I mentioned are the ones where we see the greatest funding gap for the humanitarian operation. So it's not, there's no other reason to signal them out. And indeed, as you mentioned, there are other countries that are also certainly in difficult situations in terms of the humanitarian response. When Jean Martin comes in, he may want to come in on that question as well.
Thank you, Farhan, and thank you for the briefing. This is Minglu from China Daily. Both of you mentioned that you are not very positive to secure more fundings in the future. Is there any mechanism that has been established to call for more funding and in the future, especially in the following a couple of years? Is there any actions that you've been doing to cope with the reduction of the funding now?
Yeah, I think we're doing a number of different things to raise awareness and visibility for those that are most affected by the lack of humanitarian support or the reduction in humanitarian support. So this news briefing is one of them. Jean Martin's report that he's briefed on is another. So we're trying to work on increasing advocacy and visibility, but also the evidence of the impact of these cuts, these humanitarian cuts that are there. So there's not a clean answer to that, but just to say we are as an organization, but as a humanitarian community, doing all we can to raise awareness of the issue.
Okay. All right, Gabriel?
Thank you very much for the briefing on the report. This is Gabriel Zanda from Al Jazeera English. Just two questions on Gaza, if I may. One is we've been hearing from various UN officials that the UN has 190,000 metric tons of aid pre-screened and waiting to get into Gaza when available. Can you put into regular person's terms what 190,000 metric tons of aid looks like? It's hard to imagine what that is, how much that could potentially feed. And second question is, we know that famine has been declared in parts of Gaza. How long will it take to reverse that?
Yeah, thanks. It's a good couple of questions, and I will actually ask Jean Martin to support on the latter part of your question. There's been a lot of questions about metric tons and trucks and stuff, and I think the message I want to leave you with is that 190,000 metric tons of humanitarian supplies, food and other stocks, is enough for the population of Gaza for 3 months. So that's the top line there. And indeed, we are prepared for this scale up as a humanitarian community. And Stefan has mentioned some of the issues around access and what we're looking for to move quickly on that. To alleviate famine, when an individual is malnourished, severely malnourished, it's not just a food issue, right? It's a health issue. And so, this requires multi-sector support and medical care and clean water and a number of other things. And so it's not simply a matter of moving trucks or opening bakeries, but it requires a whole sector support to that. But I will, Farhan, if it's okay, I'll ask Jean Martin if he's got anything he wants to compliment on this one.
Thanks, Ross. What I'd add is that we've seen since the start of this conflict that when WFP has access, when partners have access to Gaza, the indicators, the food security and nutrition indicators get better. There's immediately a drop in food prices. We see improvements in food consumption at the household level. This has really been our experience that when we're able to go in, things get better. Now, malnutrition is, I think that's a more specific issue. And as Ross rightly said, it is a medical problem, and that's harder to reverse. I said earlier in the presentation that malnutrition in children can have long-lasting consequences, and that's what we need to be worried about is how very vulnerable children would be able to recover from the in some cases severe acute malnutrition they've experienced. That would be the concern.
Yes, at the back. Yes.
Thanks. This is Yun Zhaopan from Xinhua News Agency. If there's no new funds in the near future, are you concerned that there might be a famine in these 6 countries? Thank you.
I mean, we're very concerned about the lack of funding indeed. So I think for a famine to occur, there's a number of things that have to go wrong, not just funding. So we're not projecting famine in these 6 countries by any means at this stage, but we are definitely trying to raise the alarm on the acute food security crisis that's there that we need all support to address.
Yes, Noreen again.
Yes, hi. My next question is for Jean Martin. You briefly mentioned the importance of safeguarding information systems, and I wanted to ask if you could expand on that, exactly what it would mean to safeguard information systems, and what would happen if those systems are not given the due consideration in the broader sort of food assistance programs. Thank you.
Thank you. In the work we do at the World Food Program, it's essential to act as soon as you can because it involves, as we just saw, sometimes very large amounts of food that need to be shipped over long distances to vulnerable places. We need information systems so that we know as soon as possible to trigger these mechanisms, to trigger shipping, to trigger procurement, ensure we have food in the right places. So we need to be able to predict. We need to be able to analyze. We need to be able to target the food assistance to those who need it most. Without data and information systems in place, or without a sufficient capacity of those systems, well, that means we might respond late to a crisis. We might miss a famine. We might not be able to understand the impact of the assistance that's taking place. We just discussed the famine in Gaza. We discussed the potential food crisis that this funding situation how it could impact the vulnerable countries we're in. All that relies on data. When we're in a situation where funding isn't sufficient, it's all the more important to have very strong data there. We're being asked to hyper prioritize beneficiaries. We're being asked to target people, a very small number of people in an ocean of need. We're being asked to do precision targeting of assistance. All that relies on a lot of data, and if we don't have the data, mistakes will be made, and unfortunately, that would only exacerbate the current crisis if we were to not keep these information systems up and running. They've been set up over the past 20 years. We've got more and more data that's been available, thankfully, but what we're seeing is that with these budget cuts, these information systems might break down, unfortunately.
Okay, I see no further questions, so I'd like once more to thank our guests, Jean Martin Bauer, the Director of Food Security and Nutrition Analysis at WFP, and Ross Smith, the Director of Emergency Preparedness and Response at WFP. Thanks very much. And for you in the press, I would like to point out that the 1:30 p.m. briefing scheduled for Dr. Alice Jill Edwards, the Special Rapporteur on Torture, has been canceled. Thanks very much.